I'm Nair of the Star Pod Trek podcast, and we are welcoming to the stage Nicholas Meyer.
So I understand that this is essentially a continuation of where we stopped yesterday. So let's assume we've heard all that other throat-clearing stuff, and we're now down to the nitty-gritty of Star Trek and Sherlock Holmes, not necessarily in that order. But I'll try to speak chronologically. I came to Los Angeles in 1971 to try to seek my fortune in the movie business. And the first job I got was a television movie that was directed by a young, we were all young, man who is still one of my friends. He gave me my break, and it was a television movie called Judge D and the Monastery.
Oh yes, I love that movie. Sorry.
You're the one.
I read those books. I was so happy to see the movie.
Well, I think ABC thought they were getting a kung fu movie, which is why they probably okayed it. For those of you who don't know, this could be a big digression, but it turns out the Chinese invented everything. And if you don't believe me, there's a book by a man named Simon Winchester called The Man Who Loved China, which is about a guy named Joseph Needham, who was a Cambridge or Oxford don, I can't remember, having nothing to do with China, by the way. And he went to China in the 20s and came away convinced that China had invented everything. So on the back of an envelope, he wrote a little outline for a book that was going to prove this. And he spent the rest of his long life writing volume after volume after volume of this encyclopedia of China's contribution, which included, as it turns out, detective stories. So there was a Chinese circuit court judge in the Tang dynasty named Di Zhenjie who solved mysteries. And some years later, a Dutch sinologist, and when I say some years, I mean some centuries later, this guy, Robert Van Gulik, started translating these Judge D mysteries, and then he started writing his own. Does this sound familiar? Anyway, so then ABC made one, and I wrote one, and that was sort of the beginning of stuff. And then I got to write a horror movie, which was a bad experience. The producers said, we would like to do a horror movie in which the men and not the women are the victims. And I said, yes, that sounds great. So I wrote a movie which was called The Honey Factor. And by the time it was released, I'm shortening things here because I like you. It was called The Invasion of the BEE Girls.
Oh my goodness.
I remember that.
Anyway, I've never seen it. That's how painful it was. What I learned was never visit your parents during pre-production, because I went home for Christmas, and when I got back, the producer said, you know, the screenplay it's like the blueprints for a building. And I said, He said, and you know, as you go along, you find out that you may need another window or an outlet where you've missed. And I said, yeah. So he said, you weren't here, so we had to make some adjustments. And I said, okay, can I see the script? And I saw the screenplay was now called The Invasion of the Bee Girls, screenplay by Nicholas Meyer and this unnamed writer who was the girlfriend of the producer. And so I called up my agent and I said, you know, you've got to take my name off this piece of shit. And he said, no, we've got to get her name off this piece of shit. And I said, No, you don't understand. This is really bad. And he said, you don't understand. You need the credit. So the Writers Guild is the arbiter of who gets screen credits. We fought very hard for that. And I've won some and I've lost some. This one I won, so my name is stuck on the damn thing. Anyway, that was sort of, and then somewhere along the line, I wrote another television movie, which I called The Night the Martians Landed, but of course it was retitled The Night That Panicked America. It was about the Orson Welles Halloween War of the Worlds broadcast. So that was all was some in the middle of all that was going on. And then the Writers Guild, we went on one of our strikes. We strike every chance we get. So you picket every day. You walk back and forth and learn all about the person who's carrying the placard next to you. And I was just really starting out, but you weren't allowed to write screenplays. And the woman with whom I was cohabiting at the time said, now you can write that Sherlock Holmes, Sigmund Freud story that you keep yakking about. And she was right. I literally had nothing else to occupy myself with after a 3-hour stint in the hot sun with this placard. So I sat down and wrote what became the 7% solution. I could give you the blow by blow, but I think what we're working up to is a trek, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But much to my astonishment, the book became the #1 best-selling novel in the United States. I was very surprised, to put it mildly. And then it was bought for the movies, and I said, I will sell it on condition that I write the screenplay, which I did. It's a very good movie. Artists are not the best judges of their own work, but I've been told, and also I've seen reviews, and also I got an Academy Award nomination. I lost to Richard Nixon. All the President's Men, that's the one. Anyway, as a result of that, I fell into another project which became the movie known as Time After Time. This was thank you. This was a guy who'd been a grad student at the Iowa Writers Workshop when I was an undergrad, contacted me and said he had this idea, and he'd written 65 pages and an outline for a novel about H.G. Wells chasing Jack the Ripper through time and winding up in San Francisco. And so he wanted some notes and advice. He said it was sort of loosely inspired by the 7% solution. So in those days I had time, and I read his 65 pages. And shortening the 3 months it took me to wake up in the middle of the night and say, you're an idiot, option his book. Because I thought it would make a much better, it was a visual idea, I thought, more than a literary idea. It was these two guys in Victorian outfits playing cat and mouse in San Francisco. So that couldn't be very expensive, because all the sci-fi hardware would be in the minds of the audience. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a Jean-Luc Godard movie called Alphaville, but that made a big impression on me when I saw it, because that was how it worked. It was all sci-fi, but it was just about changing the names of things. And people would say, hand me that communicator, and I'd give them a book, it's like that. So I optioned it. I wrote the screenplay and said I would sell this on condition that I got to direct it. And by this time, with a couple of TV movies and my Oscar nomination and my best-selling book, I had sort of credibility, or what they imagined was credibility. And so I got to do the movie, which was a wonderfully fun experience. Herb Jaffe and his son, Steve, who's still my partner, Herb no longer with us, produced the movie, and it was enormous fun. I had no idea what I was doing. I had been a stage director. I had done a lot of writing, and I had done a lot of radio plays. So I knew a fair amount. The thing I didn't know about was the camera. Unfortunate if you're a movie director. But I would make the same speech to all the people that I interviewed to be on the crew. I said, number one, I know nothing, so you're going to have to teach me. You're going to have to not mind teaching me. And if I still want to do it my way, you can't go away mad. You have to stay. And anybody who could withstand this catechism, I said, okay, you're now a member. And the movie was a success. It wasn't a colossal success, but it was enough of a success that a childhood friend of mine, whom I knew from Cape Cod, who was an executive at Paramount, said, you should meet Harve Bennett, who's going to produce the second Star Trek movie. And I said, is that the one with the man with the pointy ears? And she said, you are such a snob. I think it's fair to say that when Star Trek was on TV, I managed to miss everything that was important about it. All I saw was how cheesy it looked, and Dr. Spock, or is it Mr. Spock? I sort of missed out on the interracial, intersexual component, the international. I missed everything it was trying to do or trying to talk about, because I couldn't get past the appearance. Anyway, on the advice of Karen, I went down to Paramount and met Harve Bennett. Harve Bennett, who had produced Rich Man, Poor Man, and The $6 Million Man. Rich Man, Poor Man, I think, was the first limited television series. He was a very genial, smart guy, and we got along very well. So he showed me the first Star Trek movie, and I'm often asked, what I think about this movie, and what I think is that somebody had to go first, and I'm glad it wasn't me. I'm not a Star Trek expert of any kind, and I was a big admirer of Robert Wise. I didn't understand the movie. I have a hard time understanding a lot of things, but I sort of understood the things that I didn't want to do. And what had happened, he showed me the movie, and then he showed me several episodes of the original television show, and I still didn't understand it, but it did remind me of something that I did like, but of course it took another 2 weeks to figure out what that was, because I woke up in the middle of the night and said, oh yes, in addition to having read Sherlock Holmes when I was 11, when I was about 13, I plowed through all those C.S. Forester novels about Captain Horatio Hornblower, who I guess was an avatar for Lord Nelson in the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. And he had a lot of adventures, and he had a girl in every port. And this sounded pretty cool when you were 13. I don't know how many people have read Patrick O'Brian since, but that's the sort of the upscale version. somebody said, Jane Austen on the high seas. I wish that were my line, but I don't think it is. Well, now it is. Anyway, so I thought, oh, this is Captain Hornblower in outer space. And anyway, what happened to that script he was going to send me? Draft 5 of the movie. And I called him up and I said, so where's the script? And he said, oh, I can't send it to you. It's not good. He said something more colorful than that. Anyway. And I said, well, what about draft 4 or 3? And he said, well, you don't get it. It's just 5 different attempts to get a second Star Trek feature, which Paramount was determined to do because even though some people were not in favor of the first movie, and it was wildly expensive. I think it cost $45 million in, I think it was 1979, something like that. That's a runaway production. But it still made money. So they were going to, try again and do a much cheaper version. And these were these 5 discrete attempts to get a thing. And so I said, can you send them up? I would like to read them. In those days, you didn't hit send. A truck drove up. And it wasn't just 5 scripts, it was all the revisions of the different whatever. So I dutifully spent a week plowing through these scripts, and then I called Harv Bennett and his producing partner, Robert Sallin, over to my house for a cup of coffee, and I said, I have an idea. What if, and I pulled out a legal pad, what if we make a laundry list of things that we like in these 5 scripts? Could be a big plot, could be a subplot, could be a sequence, could be a scene, could be a character, could be a line of dialogue. It doesn't matter. And let's just make a list. And then I'll try to write a screenplay that incorporates as many of the things that are on the list. They were not happy, and I said, what's wrong? That seemed like a really plausible idea. And he said, well, the problem is that the special effects house, Industrial Light and Magic, said that unless we have a script in 12 days, we can't guarantee delivery of the shots in time for the June opening. And I said, what June opening? And they said, well, the movie is opening on something of June, I don't remember.
So were there talks at this time about it being a made-for-TV movie?
No, there was not. It was made by the television division, but it was never contemplated as a TV movie. And I said, you booked the movie into theaters and there's no movie? And they said, well, that's how it's always done. And what did I know? So I said, okay. All right, but just let's pick the things and let's go, and I'll see if I can do this in 12 days. And they still were staring at the carpet, and I said, now what's wrong? And they said, well, we couldn't even make your deal in 12 days. And that's when I made my big mistake. I said, well, look, forget about my deal, forget about the credit, forget about the money. I'm the director, that's all set. But if we don't do this now, there's no movie. So what's it going to be? When I told my agent, he was reminded that he had once considered becoming a priest. And he realized at that moment that he could not have been a very good priest because he wanted to kill me. Anyway, this is how I wound up doing this. We rated these 5 scripts. I'm not a Star Trek person. I don't know. But we picked Khan. I think that was Harv Bennett's idea. And Genesis, I don't know whose idea that was. Lieutenant Savick, that was somebody's idea. This simulator sequence, that was on page 40 of draft 3 or something. Spock wasn't in it. And so forth. It was like all higgledy-piggledy. And I remember thinking about all the things I didn't understand about Trek. I said, how come no one ever reads a book? I didn't know that reading was going out, but... and I was just wandering around, and I yanked a book off my shelf, and it was A Tale of Two Cities, the book that everybody knows the first and last lines of. So it was kind of falling together like that. I don't remember anything about the 12 days. It's just that my back was out at the end of it. And at the end of 12 days, there was a script. And it's not like we didn't amend it in the way that the Constitution has been amended since 1787. But it basically, that was the shape of it. There were discussions. Hey, somebody said, does Kirk ever meet Khan and, don't they have a fight? And I said, are you kidding? I mean, Khan is big and strong. There's no fight. I saw it on the Space Seed episode. It looks stupid. Or maybe I was just trying to get out of doing more writing. I don't remember. But I said, no, they shouldn't. And as I was writing the screenplay, and it was like fiddling with a Rubik's Cube in a way, certain themes were beginning to emerge from the writing. Like when you do brass rubbings and suddenly the outline. And I said, so this is a story about friendship, old age, death, and implacable hatred. And that somehow got me to Moby Dick, and what books did Khan take with him when he went into exile on CD Alpha 5. And this was how this script was sort of cobbled together. And the next thing by the way, there's a little sidebar. If you ever see, when you're watching a DVD, and it says the opinions expressed on this DVD are those of, and they name this, are not those of the studio, that's my little contribution to history. Because when we did the DVD of Star Trek II, I told the story that I just told you about how I wrote it. Or I did the dialogue, but as I say, it was all these 5 other scripts. And my friend Lynn O'Leary, who was then head of DVDs at Paramount, said, the lawyers say we can't use any of what you told us. I said, oh? And they said, yeah, they don't want to get in trouble with the Writers Guild. And I said, well, in that case, take me out of the DVD. I don't want to be in. If I can't tell what happened, I don't want to do puff stuff. And she said, oh, well, that's what I hoped you would say. Now I got some ammo. So she disappeared for 36 hours. And she came back and she said, okay, here's the solution. And the solution is that disclaimer that all DVDs use. And I'm very proud of that, because that turned those things from being puff pieces into being oral histories, where the different people who participated in a movie can tell you from their standpoint, what they think and feel about what occurred. Anyway, I then went up to Northern California to Industrial Light and Magic to talk special effects with the special effects team. At which point Harv Bennett called me and said, we have a problem. Bill Shatner hates the script. And I said, he hates it, but everybody loves it. Everybody loves it. And he said, well, I'm just telling you. He said, do what you got to do, and, we'll address this when you get home. So I spent the rest of the afternoon thinking, this is all bullshit. I'm just pretending that we're making a movie, which we obviously weren't. But I was looking at shots and going yes and no and this and that. And so then I went, and the next day or so, Bill Shatner came in. I've known him socially a little bit. And he said, "This is a disaster." That was his opening. And he then proceeded to go on and on and on about why it was a disaster. And my only response was that I had to keep getting up and peeing. For which I used the men's room. Yeah, okay, we'll let that lie there. Anyway, so I was always jumping up and saying, "Excuse me," he's going, "Are you all right?" And I'll say, "Yeah, no, something I ate." But I didn't know where to put the humiliation or the rage, and I didn't understand what he was saying. And finally he left. And I said to Harv, "Well, I guess that's that." And he said, hang on a minute. He said, "Let's put this into bite-sized pieces." And is it 10 o'clock and all's well?
Sorry. He's not in the dealer's room. You're the main reason why I came to this.
You missed all the dirty parts. Anyway. So, it turned out that what Bill was really on about was he was very protective of Captain Kirk as the hero of the story. This was a character with whom he was identified, and in sort of simplistic terms, Kirk needed to be the first man through the door. This is how you write for a star, which I didn't understand. But once Harv explained it to me, I said, "Oh, I can fix this." And it took 12 hours. And then Bill was calling me up and saying, "You are a genius." And I kept it on voicemail. So I could write back to him whenever I needed to. Then I cast Lieutenant Savick, which was a very attractive, light-eyed gal from Wichita, Kansas. And she was so crazy about being Savick that she used to sleep with her Spock ears on. Either that or she didn't like the early makeup call. And we made the movie. The cinematographer for the movie, Gain Rescher, also was the cinematographer for A Face in the Crowd. How many people here have seen A Face in the Crowd?
Yes.
All right,
Great
you can
Andy
stay.
Griffith
All right.
movie.
One of the great American movies. Unbelievable. And Andy Griffith must have scared the living shit out of himself, because he never went near that thing again. Never. But it's a brilliant movie, and if you haven't seen it, don't sleep. Go see the movie. Anyway, Gain Rescher, and I had sort of wonderful people, and I had a really good time. And of course, the most interesting time I had was with Ricardo Montalban. And as I explained yesterday, that is his chest. So we don't need to discuss that. But I can tell you that he was the only person I didn't get to rehearse with, because he was doing Fantasy Island. I said, "Why did you do Fantasy?" This is when we were getting drunk. Why did you do Fantasy Island? He said, "My kid needed braces." He had the longest career of anybody who was part of this movie, by far. And the stories that, when I got to know him, the stories he told were so crazy. I'll just tell you one. We grew up in Mexico, and in his village, they showed movies on a sheet. He says, "Nick, did you ever see the story of Alexander Graham Bell?" I said, "Sure, Don Amici." He said, "Yeah, but remember Loretta Young is the deaf girl that he's teaching how to..." And I said, "Yes, of course I remember." He says, "But do you remember the deaf girl's sister, because it was her whole family was in. And I said, the sister, nobody remembers this. He goes, no. It was played by her real sister,
Oh.
Georgina. And he said, I'm in Mexico looking at the sheet and I fell in love with the sister. I said, you're nuts. We're watching the story of Alexander Graham Bell and Henry Fonda and Don Amici and Loretta Young. And they're inventing that telephone. And what are you looking at? He said, I was looking at the sister. So you're a very strange person. So he said when the war broke out, all the leading men in Hollywood went into the war. So suddenly there was a call for Latin lovers, and he had been making movies in Mexico by this time. Then he went to Beverly Hills, and he was starting to be in movies, in Hollywood movies. And he went to the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills, and he said, I saw her in a parking lot. I said, did you introduce yourself? He said, no, what was I going to say? Hi, I saw you on a sheet. It just didn't sound. But eventually he did meet her. And he took her out, and he says, and we went to the Coconut Grove nightclub to go dancing. I said, why did you do that? He says, that's what we did then. So he was dancing, first dance with her, and he says, Miss Georgina, I have something to say to you, and that is that I love you and I want to marry you.
Oh.
She said, well, first I must get rid of my boyfriend. And they got married.
Oh, it cracks me up.
Anyway, his first day on the set, because I didn't get to rehearse with him, because I rehearsed with everybody else. I like to rehearse, because it saves time when you're on the set. You're not trying to figure out what the hell is you're doing or what people expect of you, or you have actors want to know one thing about the director. Is he crazy? Am I going to live? Do I have to pull the boat over the mountain? It's that kind of thing. And so rehearsal, you don't have to nail down everything, but you have to nail down enough so that people know each other and know how this thing is going to work. And I said from the very beginning, this is about the Navy. I don't know from Star Trek or Starfleet or whatever. This is about the Navy. It's the Navy in space. It's submarines. It's destroyers. I later realized that I had been terribly influenced by a movie which some of you may know called The Enemy Below.
Yes.
With Robert Mitchum. And does anybody remember who directed The Enemy Below?
No.
Dick Powell.
Thank you!
Oh, wow.
Dick Powell. It's the greatest trivia question. Now you've all got it. Dick Powell directed it. Robert Mitchum and Kurt Jurgens. And the whole Mutara Nebula thing is in The Enemy Below. Anyway, so I wanted to redecorate. One of the things when I looked at the movie of Star Trek, the movie, it looked like they were walking down a Holiday Inn corridor. It didn't look like a ship. Ships are not, and especially naval ships, Coast Guard ships. These aren't built for comfort. And I was missing signage, and I was missing the smallness of things. So I kept making things smaller. The first time I walked around the Enterprise Bridge, and I went this. And somebody said, congratulations, you just spent $65,000. So we were always sort of backing into that propeller. Anyway, I had lunch with Montalban, was the best I could do. I gave him a copy of Moby Dick. I said, read this. And so he came for his first day with his chest. And this was the scene in the cargo bays of the Botany Bay, where we learn who he is, and why he's so enraged with Kirk. Admiral Kirk never bothered to check on our progress. And it was a big, long speech. And I, coming out of theater, thought, because movies is always coitus interruptus, you say this and cut and move the camera. I said, wouldn't it be nice if we could sort of dance around him while he does this speech? And then we'll cut later, but let him work up a head of steam. Well, he worked up a head of steam all right. He came in, he was letter perfect. He knew every line, knew it cold. And I showed him, I think it was something like 23 marks
Wow.
around him. Walk here, walk there, we'll do this. And that. He had everything. It was perfect. Everything was perfect. Except that he screamed the entire thing at the top of his lungs. It was just like echoing off the soundstage. And people were looking, and I'm thinking, what do I do? How do I deal with this? This man is bigger than me. And he's worked with everybody in Hollywood. He's a very great actor. Most of the time he never got roles that were worthy of him. But he'd been on Broadway in a musical, Jamaica, Lena Horne danced. And he'd been in, I think, Man and Superman, George Bernard Shaw. This was not nobody. And he was so very courtly and polite that I had no idea sort of who he was. So at the end of this yell fest, I said, okay, let's go back into your dressing room or trailer, whatever it was, and talk a little bit about interpretation. Okay? So we sat down, and I said, Laurence Olivier, one of my big influences, once said that an actor should never show an audience his top, because once you show them your top, they know you got no place else to go. So he said, you're going to direct me. Good, he said, I need direction, because I don't know what I'm doing. And then he started telling me stories about, he was in Latin Lovers with Lana Turner, and they were playing this nightclub scene, and it was directed by Mervyn LeRoy, and I was so thrilled to be working with Mervyn LeRoy. I am a fugitive from a chain gang. I couldn't wait for the golden words of direction that I was going to get. And so we walk into this nightclub, and I'm escorting Miss Turner, and we sit down in a booth, and we're ready for the close-up, and Mervyn LeRoy says, Ricardo, Lana, make it a good scene. And he said, that's not helpful. So the closest I ever came to driving a Lamborghini was directing Ricardo, because you didn't have to say a lot. He could finish all your sentences for you. He just needed a little, And I said, the other thing about a crazy person is that a crazy person can speak very quietly, because you never know what they're going to do.
Next!
That's okay.
So we have to use the men's room.
Been there, done that. So, the movie went really quite well. When Leonard had said he would do it because he wanted to stop doing Star Trek, but by the time we got to his death scene, I think he was starting to have second thoughts, and the studio was starting to have second thoughts also, because they were seeing what this looked like to them, and maybe killing Spock was not a good idea. I thought it was a very good idea, and I tried to see to it that he was dead. And I fought the ending that we all know, tooth and nail, because I thought it was an unforgivable, dry hustle against people who really loved this character, and we were going to put him through the ringer and then say, just kidding, like God talking to Abraham about the Isaac thing. Just kidding.
So who wrote in the scene at the end with the box torpedo?
Oh, I don't know.
off and
Well, we sent him off. That was all in the script. But then they stuck him on the planet. I didn't shoot that. Over my dead body. And now I wonder, what was all the fuss about? And maybe I was wrong, or in the words of The Godfather, tell Michael it was just business. Anyway, so that was, and it then went on to be this colossal success, the Citizen Kane of sci-fi. And then I was not part of Star Trek 3. That was about resurrecting Spock, and I said, I don't know how to do resurrection. I'm not good at that. So Leonard got his directing debut into it. And meanwhile, I was writing more Sherlock Holmes novels. So after the 7% Solution, I was writing the West End horror. And when they were asking me to do that, I was having dinner with Francis Coppola. This was like 3 days before he won the Oscar for Godfather 2. And this was at his house, and I said, why did you do Godfather 2? And he said, well, there were like 3 reasons. One is they backed up a truck with a huge amount of money. Number 2 is I was curious to see if I could go back into the same mine and find another vein with more stuff in it, which relates to number 3, which is I was troubled, this is Coppola talking, I found Godfather an amoral movie, and I was troubled by its amorality, but I couldn't do anything about it because I didn't have the kind of clout that I was going to have on 2. So I wanted to make what I consider a moral film. And he said, but don't forget the part about the money. Because we live in an uncertain business. It's feast or famine. You could be out of work for a long time. But what this money does is not only gives you the opportunity to send your kids to school or whatever, but it gives you the opportunity to fail, to try things, to do different things, and put away money for a rainy day of one kind or another. So that's why I agreed to do the West End horror, which also became a bestseller. I didn't write another Holmes book for, I think, 23 years. And then I wound up doing The Canary Trainer, which is Holmes and the Phantom of the Opera, because sometimes you get an idea that simply won't let go when somebody puts it in your head. Holmes and Freud, Holmes and the Phantom of the Opera, yes. And then more recently, The Adventure of the Peculiar Protocols, which is Holmes and the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. If you don't know what that is, read the book. And then more recently, like last year, The Return of the Pharaoh, Holmes in Egypt in 1911, I think, and about archaeology and looting people's cultural and historical patrimony. And there's another one that's coming out in August, Sherlock Holmes and the Telegram from Hell. And it's about a telegram. Meanwhile, Star Trek 4 was getting going. I had nothing to do with it until I got a phone call. And the phone call was from Dawn Steele, who was head of production at Paramount, and said, you got to come in here, we have a real problem. And I had a deal on the lot. I was on the Paramount lot for 15 years. And I went in and said, what's going on? And they said, Well, Harv and Leonard made up a really cool story, and we hired 2 writers to write it, and we don't like their script, and we want to start over, and we got 6 weeks before we're supposed to start shooting. So I said, what's the story? She said, go see Harv and Leonard, they'll tell you the story. So I trudged over there, and they told me the story. I thought, what a wild story. And they said, I said, should I read the other script? And they said, no, don't read the other script. And they said, the problem is that the other script had a big featured role for Eddie Murphy. And because Eddie Murphy was a big Star Trek fan, he wanted to be in. And Ned Tannen, who was running the studio, said, there's no way we're putting our 2 most valuable assets, Eddie Murphy and Star Trek, in one movie, so start over. So basically, Harv said, I'll write the outer space parts. And I said, and I write the time after time retread. And he said, yeah. And I said, do they have to go to San Francisco? Can't they go to Paris? Just a little different. And they said something about the whales wouldn't fit in the Seine. So we were back, doing, and that's, and I had a lot of fun because I like to write comedy. People may not know this, but I'm very funny. Doesn't believe me. Anyway. Not after what happened. So that's, where do you think I'm from? She goes, don't tell me you're from outer space. He goes, no, I'm from Iowa. I just work in outer space. I loved writing that because I went to school in Iowa. So that was
It's a great line.
wasn't the only one. Anyway, you guys like Italian and so forth and so on. And so that was how I wound up doing Star Trek 4. Then I got a call from Harv, I don't know, it was a year later. Do you think you could take over Star Trek 5? I was doing what? I said, directing it. And because I was on my way to India to do The Deceivers, I think, for Merchant Ivory, which in some ways, and again, artists are not the best judges of their own work, but I think from a personal standpoint, that may be my favorite movie that I directed. I didn't write it. Michael Hurst wrote it from the book by John Masters. So I said, well, what is 5 about? And they said, well, it's about the search for God. I said, how does that end? And I couldn't do it because I was off to India, so I didn't do it. And then Star Trek 6, and I'll just do this and then we'll take questions. I was living in London, I got taken to lunch by Frank Mancuso and Martin Davids, who ran Paramount, and they said, we want to do one more movie with the original cast, and they weren't happy with the way 5 played or turned out. Could you do a Star Trek movie for $30 million? And I said, yeah. They said, do you have any ideas? And I said, no, because I never have any ideas. But then Leonard came to visit me, and we walked up and down. This was on Cape Cod, and he said, the Klingons have always been our stand-ins for the Russians. What happens if the wall comes down in outer space? And that was all I needed to get going. I just said, okay, we start with an intergalactic Chernobyl, and suddenly there's going to be mass immigration, there are going to be illegal aliens, alien trash. Yeah. And then it was like Kirk is supposed to guard the president, and the president gets assassinated because he screws up, because he's prejudiced against. And I spieled out the whole thing in about, 20 minutes, maybe it was an hour. And then we said that to Paramount and waited to be told to write the script. I waited, Leonard waited, and then we found out they'd hired 2 other writers to write the script. Oh, that was a little weird. And then I heard, oh, the boys are having a little trouble getting started. So I said, well, send them to London and I'll talk them through it. So one of them showed up, took a lot of notes, and they still didn't like it. They had hired them because they were cheaper than me. And they owed these guys a movie, and they thought they could get them for cheap. So I and my assistant, Denny Martin Flynn, started over, same, and if you look at the titles, it says story by those guys, and that was a sort of compromise thing, because they didn't write the story, and they didn't write the screenplay, but this was Leonard's fight with the Writers Guild, because he was so furious by this point, and Leonard could get very angry. And so that's how that movie got written. There could be many more stories that I could tell, but I want to give you guys a shot while we've got some time. Oh, thank you. You'll be mentioned in dispatches. So, yes.
I would love to know, given your background both with the Conan Doyle estate and what is effectively the Gene Roddenberry estate at this stage, what is the difference or the challenges in being creative at the behest of an estate or working with an estate's IP?
Very interesting question. Somebody said, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. Mm-hmm. When I wrote the 7% Solution, I was thinking I was about 27 years old. And I made some cursory examination of copyright, and I thought, oh, I'm in the clear, which I wasn't. And the Conan Doyle estate was it was the richest literary estate in the world. And the heirs, who were all scumbags, plowed it into the ground. Husbands and wives, Princess Mitivani. It was all. And then nobody cared about Sherlock Holmes. They just cared about the money, and they still care about the money. And a man named Les Klinger, who did the annotated Sherlock Holmes, the new annotated, he broke them open. He took them to court, and he proved that the copyright was over. But their little stunt that they still try is they wait till the Sherlock Holmes movie is about to come out, and then they threaten them with some kind of copyright thing. And studios, big studios like Warner Brothers, whatever, find it easier to make them a check for $10,000 and they go away than take them to court, which they would win, but they can't be bothered. So it's not a good situation. And when I wrote the 7% Solution, they did have some control. And it was only through a fluke, because a distant cousin of mine represented the Conan Doyle estate. Her name was Harriet Pilpel. She represented the estate, and she said, well, they're never going to let you do this. But it was of no interest to them at all. All they wanted was a cut of the profits, which I can tell you was no 7% solution. The Roddenberry estate is a totally different thing. That's between Gene Roddenberry and Paramount Pictures. They make deals, and I'm sure the Roddenberry estate gets a cut because this is the man who originated it. And I think I could be wrong. I don't think it's simply a legal thing. I think it's almost a moral thing.
Right.
But that's the best answer I could. Two very different. I don't have to deal with the Roddenberry estate. Yes?
Yes. On 7% Solution, you were in the company of Olivier and Nicole Williamson and Robert Duvall and Vanessa Redgrave and Herb Ross. And just what stands out in your mind about that experience?
Well, it was sort of a dream, that I got to watch this movie being made because I wanted to direct. And so I asked Ned Tannen, who at that time was running Universal and had decided to make this movie. So provision was made for me in the budget to go to Europe and watch the movie. Of course, the most amazing moment to me were the 3 days that Laurence Olivier, my idol, was, and at one point when I was first arrived in LA, I went to see the movie of, I think it was The Three Sisters, Chekhov, that he had acted in and directed. And it was like the first time in my life I understood why Chekhov was fantastic. And I went back to my little room, and very, very, in the group of powerful emotions, I wrote him a letter saying how great I thought this was, and I said, I'm trying to be a writer, and I have this novel coming out, and if you like, I'll try to get you a copy. And I quoted from The Taming of the Shrew at the end, "Too little payment for so great a debt." And I got back a rather perfunctory but nice little 2-paragraph letter. "Thank you very much, and I hope good luck with your whatever," Lawrence, which I had framed, put in my little room. But when Herb Ross said to me, when we were casting the movie, "What do you think about Laurence Olivier as Professor Moriarty?" And this little voice in my head said, "Act like a grown-up." And I said, yes, I think that would be a very good idea. He said, "Well, let's try for him." And then, it was on, it was off, it was this, it was that. He had a very tough agent. And when it was on, and it was like 5 months away before we were ever going to shoot. And I thought, he's not going to live. I'm not going to live. Even if we both live, I'll never, meet him, whatever. But finally, at Pinewood, this really happened. And it was yes, I wrote the book, "Oh, hi," and I said, "Yeah, I wrote you this letter," and he said, "Oh, that's funny, I don't remember. We didn't get a lot of letters about that one, the casual use of the royal we. We didn't get a lot of letters about the cherry orchard." And I said, "Well, I offered to, give you a copy of the book. I don't know if you..." And so what was he going to say? He said, "Of course I want." I said, "I have one right here." And I pulled it out and gave it to them. And he was on the movie for 3 days. And I had lunch with him on 3 days. And also Charles Gray, who played Mycroft, was also at these lunches. And he used to call me "Dear Boy." Because he didn't remember my name is what I figured out. "Where are you from, dear boy?" I said, "Well, I'm from New York, but I live in Los Angeles." He said, "Oh, Hollywood." He says, "Yes. Viv and I, in 1939, we were the king and queen of that place." He said, "I had just done Wuthering Heights, and she had just done Gone with the Wind. We couldn't do enough for us." And then the war broke out, and I had to go back. And one studio said, "Don't go back. You don't go back, we'll give a Spitfire in your name." Another studio said, "Don't listen to that studio. Don't go back, we'll give a Lancaster bomber in your name." And then he said, "I had to be a good boy." And he made this gesture, which I can never quite imitate, this world-weary salute. But it was great, and when he left the movie, I went into such a mood tailspin. But the one thing I did do is I took the back of his canvas chair that had his name on it, which I still have.
Cool souvenir.
Yes?
I particularly love scores too, Time After Time and The Wrath of Khan. And I was wondering how you came to choose those particular composers, because, of course, both scores absolutely enhance everything you see on screen, as any good score should. So how did you come to choosing them?
Well, I come from a family of musicians. My mother was a concert pianist. My grandfather was in the Boston Symphony in the first violin section. My dad was an excellent amateur pianist, but he could sight read so I grew up with it. My sister teaches the violin in Beverly Hills, and and I used to be a sort of parlor pianist, but my knowledge of music and also of film music is fairly encyclopedic. I'm not talking about rock and roll, but even musicals, jazz, classical, baroque, I was once thinking of titling an autobiography of mine, Everything I Know I Learned from the Back of Record Jackets, because I used to take the thing home and read all that. So I had 40 albums of Miklos Rozsa's on record. I had Ben-Hur, King of Kings, El Cid, Asphalt, Jungle, Spellbound, Naked City, Brute Force. I had a lot. And I thought that those of you who know Time After Time know it's about a Victorian guy who comes into the future. And I thought, well, if there's any rock and roll, that's a sound effect. That's another sci-fi something. But the point of view is the point of view of a Victorian guy. And somebody who could write music that was not only symphonic under the circumstances, but also had a gift for fantasy. And this was also the guy who wrote The Thief of Baghdad. And I said, it's got to be him. Warner Brothers hated this idea. They wanted Bill Conti. But long story, but I got him. And when I went to meet him, I brought all 40 albums to be autographed.
I understand.
So, and the one, I made very few, aside from spotting where we wanted the music to go, the one thing I wanted the Ripper's watch to play a little tune. And the tune, I chose the tune. It's a little song, an old French folk song, which is part of a song cycle called the Chanson d'Auvergne, which was arranged for orchestra and soprano by an early 20th century, late 19th century composer named Joseph Canteloup. And I picked this thing. And by the way, some of those songs are also in that Henry V movie used by William Walton, both. So I don't outgrow my influences, evidently. So we had a music box made that played that little tune. With Time After, were we talking about Star Trek? Was the other one?
Khan, yeah.
Khan. Well, I couldn't afford Jerry Goldsmith. Remember, the first one was $45 million. Ours was, I think, 11.2. And Jerry Goldsmith, I think, got something like $350,000 to write a film score. And we weren't quite in that league, so we started listening to cassettes of different people doing stuff. And I heard some music by this guy, James Horner, and he sounded interesting to me. So I brought him into Meet, and he and I both shared a certain deadpan humor. And I said, okay, it's going to be you. And this is what I want. Remember, this is a movie about the Navy. So I want Debussy, I want La Mer, I want the ocean. Just give me ocean and we'll be fine. And that's what he did. And that's how I picked him. When we did Star Trek VI, I could no longer afford James Horner. And that's how I discovered Cliff Idleman, who wrote one of the greatest scores of all, which was the score for Star Trek VI, in which I said, okay, I'm tired of the Rum-Ti-Tum opening that we've had since Star Wars. We've got to do something different. I have to throw him a curve. This is a movie about the Klingons. This is a mysterious, brooding, unknowable civilization. Give me Firebird. Give me the opening of Firebird. Dee-da-da-dee-da-da-dee-da-da. And that's what he went off and did. Yes.
Both now and in your book of View from the Bridge, you talk a lot about like you said, the battles over you talk about the battles over like scripts, and also there's this one part in the book that really stayed with me about the battle over the budget for Star Trek VI. and the disappointment the crushing disappointment that came with that. What kept you resilient to fight for what you believe, and also deal with those types of disappointments?
Well, this is a very interesting question, which I'm not sure. I don't wish to engage in mythopoesis and say, 20/20 hindsight. I didn't have any of that, and I'm not much of a strategic thinker. What basically happened was the feature division of Paramount, between the time I was offered to do the movie for $30 million, and I don't know, 5 months later, when I showed up from London with my family and a 6-month lease in a house in Beverly Hills to make the movie, they were having full-fledged financial difficulties, and I was suddenly told $25 million. And I said, but you can't do it. You have $14 million already tied up in the cast, the script, and the thing. You'll have $4 million in special effects, $2 million in post. That comes up to what, around $18 million. Where's the movie going to be? And they said, I'm not making this up. They said, would you excuse us for a minute? And Leonard Nimoy and Ralph Winter and Steve Jaffe and I sat there, and they went into another office for 20 minutes, and they came back and they said, 27.5. And I said, you're under a misapprehension. I'm not negotiating. I'm giving you information. I said, fuck this. I'm going to talk to Frank Mancuso. I'm going to tell him how it works and take him through chapter and verse with the money, which, by the way, I resent because I'm no good with numbers and it's taken me a lot to master this. So I go to see Frank Mancuso. He's very courtly. He has a lovely suit. He hears me out. Thank you so much for explaining this all to me. You've done it very clear. And he cancels the movie. So it cannot be said that I anticipated any of this. You know those scenes in movies where people get fired and they have a cardboard box and they're putting stuff in the thing? And I got a 6-month lease on a house, no way to pay for it. I have to go home, tell my wife and my 2 small daughters, I don't know what we're doing, but I think we're going home, maybe on air miles. And I was really in shock. And I remember sitting on the floor of Gary Lucchese's office, my agent that was, the one who was going to be a priest, he was now head of production at Paramount. And I was crying on the floor in his office. And he looked down at me and he said, Nick, you want love? Go home. We're still friends. Anyway, I started wandering around the lot. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know why I was wandering around. I didn't know what I had to say to anybody. How could I tell my wife what had happened? And I wandered into an empty soundstage where we were slated to shoot something from the movie. And back in those days, there were no cell phones except in Star Trek. They kind of invented them. But what every soundstage had was it had a pole, and on the top of the pole was a phone. And on the top of that phone was a little light, white light. So if you're shooting, they turn off the phone, but if there's a phone call, that little white light would go on. So I'm wandering around stage 5 and feeling sorry for myself, which I was entitled. And I see this white light go on this phone. It was like, nobody there. So I pick up the phone and I go, hello? And he says, Nick, this is Stanley Jaffe. Sherry and I are now running the studio. I hear you got money problems. And I had done Fatal Attraction for them. I said, yeah, I need $5 million. He said, you got it, goodbye. So Resilience didn't enter into it. You know, I have no resilience. So, you know, I'll just keep going to the bathroom and peeing. So, oh yes.
I have a question. There's something in Star Trek 2 that's always bothered me.
Oh God.
No. It's like when Khan has his people, how come there's nobody else from the series that was with him? He had nothing but young people, all blonde.
Surfer dudes.
But his people were all black and dark and all that from the original series. Whose idea was that to not have to bring anybody in? And why did it go with like the Aryan race, kind of like with Khan? Because if they had kids, they would be 15. Some of them didn't look 15, you know?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I'm curious that when you came on to Wrath of Khan, you did mention that you wanted a more military feel, a more naval feel to it. What was the reaction of the cast and everyone else involved when you expressed that?
Well, I didn't express it in so many words. I just redesigned the uniforms and did it. The cast was very professional. They were so used to different people coming on and directing different episodes. And that, you know, they were sort of philosophical. We all know the best Star Trek movie is Galaxy Quest. That's the one that really nailed it. And it was brilliant because it delivered the very thing that it spoofed. That's, you know, that's pretty amazing that it could do that. Gene Roddenberry took exception to it because he didn't think that the Starfleet was a military organization. The most he would give it was the Coast Guard. And I said, fine, Coast Guard, but they're in boats. And yes, that was... the cast was just... They liked the script because everybody had something to do. They had a part to play. And that was what was important, I think, to them as actors. Nobody was carrying the torch of Star Trek purity. There was, I think I forgot what I was going to say, so if I remember it, I'll interrupt myself. Yes?
Whose idea was it to tie the Wrath of Khan into a sort of a continuation of Space Seed?
Harv Bennett had that idea because Harv Bennett watched all the episodes, which I did not. But I do remember one thing that was, maybe it's funny. Somebody leaked the idea that Spock was going to die in this movie. There's a lot of theories as to who that was. But we would get letters from fans saying, you know, if Spock dies, you die. That kind of helpful. And I have said before, and I'll say now, the French filmmaker Robert Bresson said, my job is not to find out what the public want and give it to them. My job is to make the public want what I want. So I've never really cared in the abstract what you guys think. Because if I had left it up to you, Spock wouldn't have died. It has to, you can opt out. You cannot read the book. You cannot go to the movie. But it's not a democracy. It's a dictatorship government by consent of the governed. You can make it into a flop. You can vote with your feet. But I would never tell you a joke that I didn't think was funny on the off chance that you might be amused. I have to like it. I make an assumption that if I like the story, other people are going to like it. And if I'm wrong, you know, I'll pay a price. So we were sitting in a screening room looking at special effects test shots. It was like 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm nursing a cup of coffee, sitting behind Harv Bennett, and there's one of these, if Spock dies, you die, you know, note. And I had taken that simulator sequence from page 30 and moved it to the front of the movie because I thought it was a cool opening. But Spock wasn't in it. And I read this note, and I was kind of talking to myself. And I said, yeah, we should put him in the simulator and kill him in the first scene. And Harv turned around and goes, that is genius! And I said, you talking to me? Because it was not planned, you know. It was like a mumbled coffee moment, as best as I can remember it. So you just do the best you can, and if that's for me, tell him I'll call back. So yes.
It seems like, from the perspective of the audience and the consumer, you seem to be the type of filmmaker that's very hands-on with the mastering of the home video releases of your films. Like, you've been very present in those discs and in those releases. I was curious to find out how much of a hands-on approach a studio allows you with the mastering, the look, the content, everything like that of these various releases that have come out over the years.
Typically, the studio is not very interested. They allow much more leeway. When I did The Day After, what they call the foreign theatrical cut, I got to put back stuff that wasn't going to make it into the American network version. I had lost a couple of battles on Con with the studio. I think they have to kind of pee on things to sort of mark their territory. We're back to pee again.
Here we go. Never ends.
All roads lead. Anyway, they say, "Oh, we don't like this line" or something. So I had to take out that Scotty's nephew was Midshipman Preston, and I thought, you lose a valuable plot point by this. You don't understand why Scotty is so devastated later. So I put it back, and I didn't care. I didn't care, because they had their say. You know, if there are 15 of them sitting in a room, and every one of them doesn't have an opinion, then why are they being paid?
Right.
So you've got to say something. But typically, I don't think they're very interested in the overseas and the foreign. When I made my changes on Con, which were so slight, I think they wanted to advertise it as the director's cut. And I said, no, come on. I changed 2 little tiny things, and you think you're going to squeeze the turnip again? Enough. And so I think they call it special edition or something, but I wasn't going to let them bamboozle you.
I appreciate that.
Yes.
Yeah. Nick, I learned recently that you did some uncredited writing on Tomorrow Never Dies, the Bond film. So what was that like?
Well, it's funny because 3 of my friends were involved in making this movie.
Oh.
So Pierce Brosnan, who has
Deceivers.
been my buddy since The Deceivers, and you know, I see him all the time, and his original wife died a year before my wife, so we sort of bonded over the years. And then my brother-in-law, Roger Spottiswoode, was directing the movie.
Right.
And my good friend and protege, Jeff Kleeman, who was at Paramount and then went to work for United Artists, was the executive in charge at UA of making the movie.
Cool.
So this didn't work out very well. The movie was originally called Tomorrow Never Lies. That was what it was called. And I and a bunch of writers got flown from Los Angeles to London to brainstorm about the movie. And what we were told was, what does the villain want? And remember, the villain has already wanted the Golden Fort Knox, control of atom bombs, control of outer space, control of the oceans, and number 2, make it simple. So, you know, free airplane ride to London. They put us up at the Dorchester. I went with a girlfriend. It was like, you know, it was fun. And I had a jet-lagged moment of real inspiration. And I go around the corner to the Piccadilly offices of the Broccolis, who are the James Bond people. There's 30 people sitting there, including about 10 of the writers who were all sort of corralled in. And I said, okay, I've solved your problem. I said, James Bond movies have all the formality of an English sonnet. They really are like a haiku or something. Starts with the amazing stunt sequence, followed by the amazing credit sequence, followed with banter with Moneypenny, followed by interview with M and assignment, followed by action sequence, finally you get to meet Mr. Big, who says, no, Mr. Bond, it's not about the money, it's about... I said, so imagine that all that's happened. And now we're meeting Mr. Big in his lair. And he says, Mr. Bond, everything that's happened up till now has simply been a test between me and you. I wanted to see if you were the kind of man I think you are. Because I think when you get to know me, you'll find out that fundamentally I'm a people person. There's too many of them. And he flips on his monitors, and every image of overpopulation that you could possibly see, traffic jams in Atlanta, starving people in Ethiopia.
I like this guy already.
And every image. He said, Mr. Bond, even lemmings know what to do when they grow too numerous. 007. That's some kind of license, isn't it? Tell me, how much game are you allowed to bag with that 007 license? I'm trying to save planet Earth. Would you help me? No politician will touch this. Will you help me save the human race and planet Earth? And Bond says, yes, I will. And there's 30 people going, like that. And I said, don't worry, it's not really going to help. Anyway, I went out of there thinking, it was simple, nobody's done it before, and it was the best kind of villain because Bond would have to be really good to be up against that logic because everything he said is right. And I came back the next day, it was gone. Too real. He wanted to start a war between India and China, the two most popular, cull the herd. Anyway, so that was my Bond story.
Oh.
Guys, I think we have to wrap this up because I think you're dying. But thanks so much for coming, and I hope you buy a book.
Yeah.